editor at Warren Publications before coming over to Marvel, and worked as an editor there from 1980 to 1983. Among other titles, she worked on an obscure little title called Uncanny X-Men, the Conan title, New Mutants, also with adapted material, Star Wars, and the Adventures of Indiana Jones, and has a very distinguished career as a comics writer as well. I'll just do a plug. You've got a panel tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock, I believe, on the series Power Pack with June Brigman. Yeah, which was a groundbreaking series when it was introduced, and still is, and a rare series in comics history by two female creators. So kudos for that, among other things.
And just to say, Carl was my editor on that.
Well, that's very fortuitous. That's
We're going
great.
to try to get him on that panel tomorrow, if you'll do it.
All right.
It was the easiest job. I just read the plots when they came in, smile, and pass them on.
Fantastic. Well, let me introduce our other panelists. As I said, we've had some changes in the configuration of the panel, but this is Carl Potts. Carl was a Marvel editor for 13 years, but draws, writes, and teaches at the School of Visual Arts. Among the titles he edited at Marvel were The Hulk, Doctor Strange, Defenders, Moon Knight, the first Rocket Raccoon series, right? So maybe he's a Mike Mignola fan. That was his
Took
first solo.
35 years to be vindicated.
It's happened.
Yeah,
That was his
don't
first
forget-
solo series? That was Mike Mignola's
Yeah,
first
he was
solo
an
series?
inker up until I find this. He'll tell you himself he was a very poor man. But when his pages would come in, ink pages, the backs of the pages would fill these amazing character drawings that he'd do. So Bill Mantlo and I would look at them, and Bill was running through the Rocket Raccoon miniseries. We said, that's the guy. So.
That's fabulous. Carl has a great career as a creator, as I said, as an artist, and I see that you were wearing a pin for Alien Legion,
Yeah.
which came out from Epic. I'm not going to be able to pull up the year for that.
That would probably be early '84. It was the third Epic Comics title after Dreadstar Invasion.
Great. Yeah. So we are very fortunate to have our panelists here today. I'm going to try to stay out of the way and just pose a few questions at the beginning of this, and then we'll turn this loose about midway through for questions from all of you. So be thinking about those. I'm going to start at a really basic level for you guys, and just ask the question: what does an editor do? What is a day in the life of an editor like? Is there such a thing as a typical day in the life? Take us behind the scenes to the history of comic book creation.
Ideally, an editor does anything necessary to get the best possible work out of the brilliant creators that work for them.
Within the time.
Within the time, yes.
Without getting Virginia involved.
Yes, because we did have a production woman who was actually lovely. John Romita, I don't know if you guys know John Romita Sr. It was his wife who ran production at Marvel, and every Wednesday, was it? What was it? Virginia Day.
Yeah.
It was Wednesday.
I think so.
All the editors would have a big meeting with Virginia, and she would have a chart, and she'd say, okay, why is this book late? And why is this book late? And why is this book late? And how are you going to fix it? Yep. For my husband, Walter, who was an artist and writer on Thor, his editor was Mark Grunwald, and Mark would tell Virginia, we are aware of the problem, and it's going to get better. And every week, she would say that, and eventually, Walter got off the series, and then it caught up.
Pretty memorable run.
But that was kind of typical. Carl goes above and beyond, though, as an editor on Power Pack. June had some problems conceiving ideas for several things, like Friday.
Friday, yeah. And I kind of co-created the Snarks, I think.
Yeah, that's what you did. You're the one who came with the idea of the start with the legs.
Kind of grasshopper.
So, I mean, you give the help where the help is needed.
Yeah.
And Carl was amazing.
Oh, thanks. It was, I gotta say, during my 13 years on staff at Marvel, I was telling somebody earlier, I'd say at least 10 and a half of them was the best work environment I've ever encountered.
Yes.
There were a lot of great people out there. For the most part, a few exceptions, for the most part, we got along. we would be, without even trying, we were constantly bouncing ideas off each other, you know, brainstorming without trying. One example I have is actually involves Louise here, where I had a print of a science fiction illustration I'd done when I was a full-time illustrator of this young woman in a spacesuit with a little creature on the shoulder, and I had that print up in my office, and of course Carmen came by one day and said, that looks kind of like Kitty if you change that creature to Lockheed or Red Star around it. So you wrote the plot, and eventually Louise did the final script on it. Stuff like that just happened every day.
And you said it was 10 and a half years were really great. Was there a certain point at which that changed?
Well, the last year or so of a tall person's reign were a little difficult. And then when Marvel got bought by corporate raiders and started getting rid of the executives who had helped set the corporate culture and replacing them with bean counters and just wrecked the culture and just really kind of tore the spirit of the company.
Would this be around the end of the 1980s, early 1990s?
It would have been I guess close to the mid-90s, somewhere, you know, around 94 to 6.
I was over it. I had gotten mad at Marvel and had stomped over to DC to write Superman at that point, so I don't know what was going on over it. We heard stories over there, though.
It wasn't fun.
Yeah, us, the people who had shifted to the other guys, because back in the olden days, just as creators did, editors too moved back and forth sometimes.
Oh, yeah. How many times did Denny and Archie bounce back and forth?
I think they were editor-in-chief of both companies at one point. You know, you'd get mad at one company because they had done something that irritated you, and you'd stomp over to the other guys, and they would hire you and usually give you a raise. It was one way to get your rate up, is to go over and work for the other guys for a while, and then you'd come back to Marvel when you got mad at somebody at DC, and you know they'd give you a raise and give you a book to write. So and it was kind of fun back in those days. I don't know if they do that so much anymore. Yeah, I think the world's different now. We worked during the golden age of Marvel, actually.
Yeah, one of the things back then that the editor pretty much had total control of all the creative aspects of their books back then. Nowadays, a lot of the editors have to answer to multiple layers above them for approval on different aspects of what's going on. It's gotten very complex that, you know, when we were editing, you were pretty much the be-all and end-all when it came to decision making. It included who you hired for a book, and that was kind of an art in itself because most of Marvel's work was done what was called Marvel style, where the plot was written first, then it went to the penciler who made the decisions on the pacing and you know what to emphasize and de-emphasize, and sometimes adding plot elements. And then it would go back to the writer to do the final script, and they would often get to play off things that the artist had added, or sometimes have to compensate for something that you didn't put in. But so the editor had to try and make sure they were matching up the right talents together, because if one of them was weak in a certain area and the other one wasn't able to make up for it, then that could be a huge problem. Sometimes you had no choice, you just had to get warm bodies in there to do something. And it was so late. But
Let me ask you a two-part question following up on that. So starting with the sort of contemporary state of comics, is there more control now because the characters are such lucrative properties? Because comics function as idea factories.
I think so. I also think that companies, as they advance, begin to try to acquire more control just on general principle. And then eventually the product becomes controlled.
So let's go back to that golden age then. In terms of what the editor is doing and sort of overseeing the direction of the title, is the editor working with the writer and working out plots and maybe working out a long-term direction? Here's where the title's going to go for the next 6 months or so, or does that evolve organically, or is it all of the above?
It depends on who you're working with.
all of the above.
Yeah.
If sometimes the writer and the penciler were very tight, and they would, you know, brainstorm together So it varied. I was just telling Louise on the way up here that, you know, sometimes you get plots, including most of hers, where I would read them and I just think, this is a great story. I don't have to do anything, and pass it on to the artist to write. Other times I sit there going, what the hell is this? Isn't what we discussed. Sometimes you'd be working with different people so that you might work out like a 6-month stretch beforehand, and it could evolve as it went along. Other times, you know, you might have enough confidence in a writer that you can kind of like have them do a series of single issues for a while, and then you decide you want to do a larger arc or something. So it just varied on the relationship.
Power Pack. This is back in Power Pack, when we did Power Pack. I tend to work with artists who are slow. It's just my karma. So June Brickman was drawing Power Pack at the time. It was her first jobs, and she would work as hard and as fast as she could, but she kept falling a little bit behind. And when she fell behind, we did a fill-in issue, which I would write. It's another artist, Bryn Anderson, usually would draw.
Yeah, I think
And we would do Carl's hobbies. we did
we seem to
baseball.
have better her editor. She
Oh,
picks up
no,
the
it was
time.
fun. I learned a lot. I know, we had fun. We went to a baseball game. I didn't know much about baseball. We went to a baseball game, and then I studied up on baseball and did a baseball story. Then we did the aquarium story. Carl loves fish, right?
I'm an amateur aquatic biologist.
And so we went to the aquarium. We took lots of pictures of the aquarium at Coney, thank you. Staten Island, Coney Island, and used it as reference for Brent to draw our fish story. And then did we do another one after that?
I can't remember.
Yeah, I think that may have been it.
Yeah.
But it was, I mean, that's another way an editor helps, is it gives you ideas.
Yeah, and it just, the other thing too is like, since at that point anyway, June was able to draw like 4 monthly issues in a 5-month period.
Right.
We could plan ahead at every, 5th issue or something we would need to fill in, and we'd just be able to plan ahead for that.
That seems like a model that the industry has adapted now, because you see a particular arc with a single artist, and there seems to be a plan ahead, so.
I don't know if they're planning that much. Or just reacting to
Well, maybe so. I'll take that back.
who's available or what.
Yeah, I'll take that back. Let me just, again, a real basic question. So I mentioned a few of the titles you guys worked on. What were some favorite titles that you worked on? Ones that really stood out and said, this is a great experience.
As an
I
editor?
have it together. As an editor.
Oh, I loved the X titles. I loved working with Chris Claremont. He was just fun. I know that, some people found him difficult, but I never found him anything other than just brilliant. The worst thing that could happen with Chris is he'd come in and he'd say, I've run out of ideas. I can't think of any more ideas. And I'd say, Chris, you left this opening in this story, this opening in this story, this opening in. He'd say, oh. And then he'd go away and be brilliant for another year before he ran out of other ideas, and I could remind him of it. So I mean, I love the whole experience. When we did New Mutants, after that, and that was great. No, so as an editor, I think working on the X books was my favorite. I did a lot of other things too,
Now,
but I think that
for a
was my
while there,
favorite.
you had a team of 2 headstrong people that didn't always see eye to eye. How
You're
did you
talking
deal with
about
that?
Chris and Bern?
Yeah.
Oh, Bern quit. I sided with Chris on something, and Bern got mad, and he walked over to do, which Bern is fortunate. John Bern did well. He called me up at home, and he said, I've decided that I'm going to go off and write the Fantastic Four, and write and draw it, which is really what he should have been doing. He should have been writing and drawing his own book, rather than drawing somebody else's book. So it really worked out. But he tells me this, and I'm thinking, oh my God, I think this was like the 3rd or 4th issue in, after Days of Future Past, I believe. And I thought, oh my God, I've killed it. I have this wonderful book, which he and Chris had worked on for years, it seems like. And I said, I've killed it. This is going to be the end. They're going to fire my ass. But really, it worked out okay, because, we had other people who came and helped out, and it was fine.
Do you remember the nature of the disagreement between the two of them? Where they butted heads?
Oh, it was creative differences.
Sure.
They would work out plots together, and John would draw them, and Chris would create dialogue because it was Marvel style, as Carl was talking about. He would put the dialogue in, and John would get mad because it really wasn't what he thought the dialogue was going to be or should have been. So then, then you'd have a big argument about whether or not, whose idea for the dialogue was the best, and I did side with Chris, and he got mad. And I don't blame him. He really wanted to do what he wanted to do. He's very creative and very smart, and really he should have been writing and drawing his own book, and he did. And it really worked out better for everyone that way.
Before that point, there were times when we were at the office and we could see like both Byrne and Claremont were going into Wheezy's office for a story conference, and they both looked like they were not amused with each other.
They were not.
And often, after 15 or 20 minutes, the door would open, both of them would walk out with big smiles, and there's another editor of Marvel, Ralph Macchio, who used to call it the Wheezy effect, where, she could be in a conference with people who were in contention and often come up with the best solution, and without even trying, almost make them each thought that they'd come up with it.
They probably had.
You put it in words?
Maybe that was it, yeah.
But the Wheezy effect, Wheezy effects are about, you saved me from being fired once with the Wheezy effect.
I did.
Yeah.
And I think I more like grabbed your collar and pulled you back.
And what was the occasion for this? What happened?
Someone in a position of power had, Wheezy had come to me with an idea for a big project, because she knew I liked working with new talent and so on.
Oh, yeah.
And so
And you're a good designer, too.
and we developed it, and then we went and pitched it, and somebody in a higher position got wind of it and decided that it was their idea.
Oh, yeah.
And
It was at a Virginia meeting.
it was something.
It was a Virginia meeting, is where and Jim
like,
announces it.
And like an idiot, I piped in and said, "You mean Wheezy's idea?" And I got this kind of Frankenstein look.
Oh, Shooter said, "That was my idea." And Carl goes, and I go, and I grabbed his collar and yanked him back before he went for Shooter's throat, and that was, I saved you.
Yes, you did.
I admit that day I saved you.
So that
He was very fierce.
The Wheezy effect in action.
So Carl, what was the title that stood out for you in your editing team?
Well, I'm not saying it just because she's here, but Power Pack from the beginning, like I don't know, how many editors did you show that to before I saw it?
Nobody.
Okay.
I chose you. I showed it to Shooter.
Yeah.
And, I showed him, and Power Pack was a new idea I had. Shooter had been after his editors to do freelance work, and I didn't want to take any work away from any freelancers that already had work because they were supporting their families and, being able to eat and stuff and pay their rent. So I said, well, I thought maybe if I came up with something new, I wouldn't be stealing work, I'd be, adding to the pile rather than taking away. And so I went to Shooter, I said, I have this idea for 4 little kids who are superheroes. And Shooter sort of rolled his eyes and he said, well, write it up, maybe we'll get a mini-series out of it. And so I wrote it up, and then June Brickman, a young artist, came into my office, and I didn't have any, showing me work as an editor, and I didn't have any work for her as an editor. But I said, can you draw kids? And it turned out, yes, she could. So I said, well, take this is the script, this is, what I'm proposing. Take it home and draw the kids. And if I like what you did, I'll propose this as a team. So June came back with these wonderful little drawings of, the kids, just in their attitudes were great. Yeah. Jack with his little pouty face and all of that. And so I said, oh, this is great, okay, we're a team. And I gave the proposal to Shooter. And Shooter read it, and 2 days later he came back and he said, this is great, I love it. It's a series. And the first issue is a double issue, and it was due really soon, right? And June, no one,
June had never drawn a comic before.
Yeah. And I had never actually written a long comic before. So we were,
But what makes
So-
you think of me? There's like, you know, you had
because
everything.
I knew you and I knew how good you were and I knew you were good at working with young people. And June was young at the time, and she was in her early 20s, I think.
Okay, thanks, I appreciate it.
No, you were the chosen editor.
Okay, I didn't know if I was like the end of a long line.
No. You were. I'm glad you took it. Thank you.
So like I said, it was a joy. I enjoyed it. And I have very eclectic tastes. If you look at my outfit, I mean, I was editing The Punisher while doing Rocket Raccoon and What the, and Solomon Kane and Doctor Strange and Amazing High Adventure. I very eclectic taste, which is one of the reasons I think they asked me to take over Epic when Archie left, because they knew I liked all kinds of different things. But it was, and that variety kept me happy too. But it's, if you were doing like what we did, where you were working on your own creative stuff at the same time you had your staff job, and you were able to maintain that balance well without going berserk or nuts or whatever, or driving your spouse nuts, then it was just the perfect thing, because you're working with all these great talented people on the creative side and the editorial side every day, and most of us, I think, actually look forward to going to work most of the time.
I mean, comics, it was fun. Back in the olden days, it was great.
Yeah.
You had to live in the city, or pretty much around the city.
Yeah, I lived
Because
right, but I took the commuter.
There was no FedEx, and there was no internet.
No.
Virtually no internet.
No,
You
there
didn't,
was
so
no.
then you,
Fax machines were just coming in.
sure, to be able to turn your work in, you kind of had to be there.
Yeah. Back then, FedEx had one-day delivery. The way they did that with scripts is they'd fax it from one office to the other, then they'd messenger it over.
That's funny.
Now, since you guys are both creators, was it difficult then to take off the editor hat to be the creator and to work with somebody else as an editor?
No, I think it made me appreciate editors even more. I mean, what you do, and you don't think that much of it. It's like no big deal. You just kind of are muddling along the best you can. I mean, what does Larry say? I've been faking it all my life.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of how I felt about it. And but when you work with an editor, and an editor is so very helpful
If they're good.
if they're good. Yes.
I got Sal, which was one who was not.
I did too. We won't talk about them.
But I did say when that
You won't name
happened,
names.
when I did get saddled with an editor that was not good, I wanted real editorial input. So I would take my plots to Ralph Macchio, who wasn't the editor, and as a favor to me, he'd read them and give me feedback on them. Real editorial feedback, as opposed to the garbage I was getting out of the person I was assigned to. So we, editors are great, but you shouldn't edit your own writing.
Right.
You gotta read it.
You always knew how to set eyes.
Yeah. Unless they're someone who is clueless, and you take it to Teresa.
But I know who that was.
All right, we'll try to provide those secrets a little bit later on. In terms of the creators that you work with, were there some creators who were favorites to work with, or maybe some creators who were kind of problem children?
I loved working with Tom Palmer as an inker. Tom, he inked Walter, my husband, on Star Wars, and Walter was doing layouts, so it was like rougher drawing than he would be rather than finished. But Tom didn't need anything really finished. He was a beautiful finisher, and he would get you things on time. You didn't have to lie to him about when the deadline was, because if you told him the deadline was such and such, he would kill himself. He would stay up all night to get things in, because that was the kind of guy he was, and it would come in really good. So I really admired Tom.
And was that a strategy with other creators to give them?
When I was at Warren, and Russ Heath would turn in a book exactly 1 week after the deadline. So that was easy. You know, I just gave him a deadline that was a week before I needed it, and it would come in. I mean, the deal at Warren, which was pretty cool, was that you would bring in your work, and they would hand you a check for it. I mean, that was really in the olden days.
See, I wasn't as smart as that. Virginia Ramita work out these idealized schedules that
Oh,
are
yes.
really difficult to keep up with. But I was determined to try and stay on them, and so, in fact, when those weekly schedule meetings with Virginia, when I first got up there, whoever had the most on-time books, they had some funky, funny cardboard thing that they put on the door of your ward, you know, for being there. So not too long after I got there, the award ended up on my door and never moved, and she stopped awarding it. But I would, you know, go by those dates and on the Virginia schedule, and I just figured if I was going to work with a professional, they would go with that. And occasionally, reality would slap me in the face. But then, you know, sometimes in retrospect, you know, some of the excuses that we got over the years for being late on stuff, some of them are hilarious. I had one person who had at least 4 grandmothers die over the course of like a year and a half or so. And I suppose that's possible if there were a lot of marriages or something.
This happens to my students too, so.
And I told this story in the earlier panel today where there was someone who, when I became an editor, I knew a bunch of really talented people. I thought, oh, I'm in a position to give them a chance now. So I gave this person a couple jobs, and they screwed up the deadlines on both. And the second one, they weren't answering the phone anymore. They lived on the West Coast, and I was in New York. And so I'd call, and they wouldn't pick up the phone. And so I stayed in the office late one night and called when no call should be expected from New York, and they picked up the phone. And there's no caller ID back then either. So I gave him my phone. I said, I haven't heard from you. You're weeks late. Picking up the phone. What's the story? And he gave me this thing like, he lived in the desert, and he had a swamp cooler, which is like an evaporator instead of your traditional air conditioner. And he said that the only room he had for his drawing table was right next to the vent, so there was a 60-mile-an-hour wind across his desk all day long. So by the time the brush left the ink bottle and hit the page, it was dry. So I told him to get any pages done, pack them up, send them out that day with that day's post date, and then we were done, and I never worked with him again. But he gave me a great story. There was one
That's
guy
incredible.
I think you worked with who was extremely noise sensitive.
That was David.
And he moved out of New York for that. He moved to the country, and tell him what happened.
Okay, David's excuse for not turning, it was unusual, when he was actually very reliable. David McLeany. He was another person who was a pleasure to work with. But he was late on something, and it would have been Star Wars probably. And I said, what's the deal? And he said, birds have built a nest outside of my window, and they keep chirping. And I can't get
babies.
Babies had babies. Yeah, the eggs hatched, and he couldn't get anything done. And normally I would have rolled my eyes at such an absurd excuse, but for David it was legit. I mean, he needed absolute quiet. He got an apartment once it was down near the river, because he had been told it was very quiet there, and a tap dancer moved in above I think that's when he left the city.
But why didn't, because back then he would have been dealing with an electric typewriter, and why didn't you pick it up and move to another room in the house?
Maybe, we had little bitty apartments back in the day, maybe.
No, but that's
No,
the one where you
that was
moved
a
out of the
decent sized
country,
apartment.
so,
I don't know.
I don't know.
That never occurred to me.
But even in retrospect, that stuff, it might have been steamed at the moment, but it was just, later on we laughed at it.
Oh, yeah. I had another artist whose name shall not be mentioned, who said that he had done the pages, and they were sitting on the washing machine, and his wife had piled clothes on top of them, and then put the pages in the washer. And I didn't believe that. That was over.
That sounds so real. Particularly since the size of the pages wouldn't have fit.
I question not the ways of the force. That was.
We're going in a different direction. You guys have both about working under Jim Shooter.
Yes.
Shooter, editor of Marvel for about 9 years. And someone about whom there is at least a negative perception in the industry. What was it like working with Shooter?
He was definitely a weird combination of really good in some areas and the opposite in others.
Yeah.
It was, and you couldn't always tell which one you were getting.
That's right.
So,
Yeah, Shooter would go in his office as being the good guy and come out the bad guy sometime, or vice versa. You know, you never knew what you were going to get. In some ways, he's a really good editor-in-chief. I mean, he had opinions. He said to me, I guess probably all of us maybe, that the role of an editor is to have an opinion. And he had a vision for the way things that ought to be. He got a little carried away is all. You know, in expressing his vision, it was never nuanced. It was always, this is the way it ought to be. And, you know, we all kind of worked around him. I know on the X-Men books, we worked around him a bit because he would want us to do things. He wanted us to do a scene. He came into my office and said he wanted us to do a scene where Professor Xavier writes checks out to all the people that Wolverine has harmed with his claws.
That's a lifetime.
That's like, yes. And I said, oh gosh, Jim, you know, we have a place a couple of months down the schedule that I think I could probably fit that in. And then
never happened.
we didn't do it. And then he'd come in, you know, 6 months later and he'd say, you know, when are you gonna do that scene? And I'd say, a couple of months. You know, no, it was fine. I don't think he really wanted us to do it
See,
because he could have carried on.
I would have had someone actually pencil those pages, have them in the drawer, and said, Jim, look at the drawer. When I find the right spot, I'll put those in there.
Oh, that's good. See?
Let me turn this loose to the audience and see if you guys have questions.
I have some for Louise. How did you first get involved in writing comics, and what attracted you to that world and keeps you going in that world?
So how did you get started as writers of comics?
Oh,
Well,
well,
as creators in general, perhaps?
yeah, well, I got started in comics and working for comic book company because one of my friends worked at a black and white publisher, horror book comic publisher called Warren Publishing, and I got started there because she said, there's a job opening here and it pays better than the job that you have. You should apply. So I did. And I got the job, and it was, you know, it was honestly love at first sight. I mean, I had read comics, but I'd never worked in them. And it was, you know, the people in comics are just they're really cool, aren't they? They're nice people generally. And it's a really fun thing to do, words and pictures.
There's a lot of interesting characters.
Yes, there are. You get good stories.
Yeah.
So that's how I got into comics. And then once I started writing, you know, once I was an editor for a while, I got bored. Shooter hired a whole batch of new editors. Do you remember that?
Well,
And that's when I got bored.
Yeah, I think I came out there. At one point, the editorial workload was really quite high.
Yeah.
And then it was decided that the ideal workload would be 5 monthly books plus, you know, a handful of odds and ends, annuals, graphic novel, miniseries here and there. And that seemed like a more reasonable workload.
Well, I was doing at that point the equivalent of 11 books a month because I had Conan, which was like 3 books, right, or 4 books in one at that point, and the Conan magazine, and then I had the Conan book, and then I had King Conan, and then I had Star Wars, and I had Indiana Jones, and I don't know what else, X-Men, X-books. So when Shooter hired new editors, I got my workload cut in half. It was like, I was bored. And that's when I came up with PowerPack.
You just reminded me of another example of the Louise effect. Before I got asked to be an editor and like that, I was primarily an artist and started getting into writing. And I'd done this Conan piece that in color that I thought would be a great Savage Sword cover. So I took it up to show you at the Madison Anatomy office. I don't know if you remember this. And you know, looking at it back on now, I can't believe I ever thought it was cover-worthy material. That was pretty early on. And you came out with this big smile on your face, goes, you know, I think this would look better in black and white. Let's use it as frontispiece. And I went down there with a big smile on my face. You know, that's the Louise effect.
That's funny. Well,
But I had no
and
plan.
did it work? Was
Yeah.
it better in black and white?
Probably. But I had no plans to be an editor. I'd never thought about doing it, but I'd been combining writing and drawing for a while, and whatever small amount I did apparently got Jim Shooter's attention. He knew that I knew something about plot structure and I knew visual storytelling, and he seemed also very impressed that I made my living for the most part working as a storyboard artist at ad agencies. For some reason that impressed him. So when Al Milgram, who'd been on staff a long time, decided to go freelance full-time, they needed an editor. Apparently Jim didn't think any of that current crop of assistant editors were ready to be promoted. So he started asking around for suggestions, and I guess Alan and Bill Sienkiewicz suggested me, which I don't know what they were thinking because I'd never talked about being an editor before. And so I get this call out of the blue, and I was like, wow, that sounds like an interesting job. And also what really helped is that my first week in was overlapping Milgram's last week, so he was there to help me, you know, meet all the people that were working on books I was inheriting and so on. And I inherited Alan's very experienced naval assistant, Ann Nascente, which helped me a lot.
Great writer.
Oh, yeah, she's great.
So my first day on the job, when we were going through the slush pile of submissions that hadn't been answered, I discovered this kid named Art Adams. And a little while later, Ann's talking about this weird idea for some guy whose power is luck. What the hell? She seemed very into it. So I matched her up with Art.
Which was a great match.
And then it moved over to the X office, and Longshot was born. So that's the kind of stuff that happened all the time. It's just like you never knew when you were going in the morning, you know, what kind of really interesting combinations of creative things were going to happen. It was great.
Let me just follow up on the audience question, and because you mentioned a couple of terms, plot structure and visual storytelling. So for somebody who wants to break into the industry, maybe to break in as a writer, are there certain principles that that person needs to internalize about what a plot structure should be, how that should work, how visual storytelling should work?
Yeah, Carl, you teach that stuff.
Yeah.
You just go right ahead.
But you're better at executing it. Well, it depends. If you're doing an ongoing series, you've got this interesting problem where you have to, ideally, every issue will have its own arc. Will it be some sort of, you know, real problem for your main protagonist that they have to contend with, and usually their initial attempts only make it worse. And then something they learn along the way helps them figure out how to resolve things. But if you're doing an ongoing character, you can't do like a self-contained story where you can really just put your character through the ringer, you know, each and every time. You can't like have them, you know, have their whole life get upset, you know, the family is killed or they lose a limb or something. That's not going to work for Spider-Man. So you have to give the illusion of change somehow each time.
And that's something that's raised from Stan Lee.
Right. You know, you create a problem and then you solve it pretty much
But
with a lot of angst along the way.
and as there's a script writing doctor or teacher, Robert McKee, who is very knowledgeable. And if you go see his live shows, you'll learn a lot. But he's a pompous ass, so be prepared. Don't
He also has a book. You
Yeah.
just skip the show and just
Yeah.
read the book.
Yeah, but he says, you know, give them what they expect, but not the way they expect it. They expect that classic art, but how you execute it should be in a way they're not really expecting it. And that's not easy to do, you know, after, you know, umpteen years of a character in their own book. It's not easy. So I've got your work cut out for you.
Louise, any advice you'd give to our would-be writers?
Oh, gosh. The advice I give is just write. Practice, practice, practice. You know, write, you know, if you can write for other people as well as yourself, you know, write for if you're in school, write for your school literary magazine, write for, you know, anybody that you can actually get to read it and maybe get feedback on. Getting feedback is really hard if you're not, you know, don't have professionals to give you feedback.
When you ask your family, they're going to say, oh, that's great.
Yeah, their family will think it's brilliant, but, you know, just keep doing it. The more, you know, how many bad books are people supposed to have in them before they finally do a good one? 10? I don't know.
I don't know.
Whatever. So that, you know, it takes a lot of practice to kind of hone your craft. I think, I actually still read books about writing just because you know, sometimes you're going along and you're kind of in a run, you forget, oh gosh, I could do that.
Yeah.
And you read something and it will prompt in your mind a way of doing something that's a little different. Somebody some other writer will have an idea. So, you know, I'd say get yourself educated. And there are a lot of good books out there on writing. I think the book story Robert McKee is a really good one.
And just for the classic hero journeys are Christopher Vogler's The Writer's Journey is really good. He kind of distills Joseph Campbell's stuff in pretty well.
There's a very simple book that's out called Save the Cat.
Oh yeah, that's to me that's like
It's a primer. It's very simple.
yeah, but it's also can be used for ill as well as for good.
Oh, tell me.
Well, in there, he's got this whole, list of plot points for a screenplay that are supposed to occur in this order by these pages each time.
Oh yeah.
So,
Try doing that in a
took-
22-page comic or 20-page comic.
Exactly.
I did try that because I wanted to see what happened.
Yeah.
It is doable,
Yeah.
but I'm not sure it's comprehensible. We'll have to see when it comes out.
My problem with it is that some people can follow that and they can write something that is, technically crafted real well and has absolutely no soul.
Right.
So,
Yes, that is the problem
so
with that.
what I teach is that, know who your main character is, know what their needs and wants are, and there should be some internal conflict between their wants and needs, and know where you want them to end up in the story, and then figure the rough general route, but then write the first draft from your gut. Don't worry about structure and all that. It's half of it's at least in your mind anyway from everything you've read it before, what classic story arcs are. But then after you write, let yourself experiment. If something occurs to you, go off. You can always cut stuff back. It's not easy. It's much easier to cut stuff to make it work better than it is to crazy glue stuff on later to try and make it work. But then go take it to one of the classic story arc models, whether it's the Save the Cat one or Chris Vogler's, and see how your story compares up with that. And where your story varies, ask yourself as honestly as you can, would it be a better story if I did make it adhere more classically to the art, or did I come up with something different that really works? And you gotta be careful not to fool yourself just because you like what you did. And more often than not with me, I realize that it would be better if I made it adhere to the story better. But so the example I'd use is that say stories about me. I know me. I'm originally from the San Francisco Bay Area. I've been living in New York a long time. I'm tired of it. I want to move back to where San Francisco. I actually like that weather. And the music scene, and I still got old friends and family out there. So I'm going to get in my car, and and I'm gonna drive from New York across Highway 80, which goes right across, all the way across the Bay Bridge in San Francisco. So that's all I need to know, and then I start writing the first draft, and as I'm writing, things occur to me what happened. I stop somewhere and meet somebody and have some sort of incident that I hadn't really counted on, whatever. As I'm near Chicago, I hear on the radio that my favorite band of all time is reforming for 1 night and 4 days, so I end up spending time in Chicago. So this just happens along the way, but eventually I keep finding my way back to Highway 80 and moving across. But somewhere along the way, someone says something that makes me realize that all the things I like about San Francisco also occur, look down the coast in the Monterey Carmel area, but they don't have those goddamn hills. I hate those goddamn hills. I'm driving a stick shift and the stop sign is right before the friggin' apex, and then I have to park on them and I have to walk up and down. So I ended up in Monterey or Carmel, but the only reason I end up there is because I had a spot I was aiming for first. If I just got in my car and meandered all over the country, I might have had some interesting incidents, but they wouldn't have held together, and I would have just meandered and petered out, or I have to come up with some Deus Ex Machina thing to wrap things up. You have to have that at least initial focus, even if it changes, and if it does change, it's within the context of what happened along the way.
So what you mean is, you want to know the end of the story. You want to know where you're heading. It helps to know where you're heading before you start the story.
Yeah, you need to have some sort of focus, even if you end up changing it.
Right, oh yeah.
But if you just go wander, like there are some people that apparently can just sit down with a basic concept and write a story and have it end up being a satisfying piece of work. It ain't me. And I think it's most people. I think most people that think they do are fooling themselves.
I think when you talk about writing and teaching, we always talk about the act of discovery in writing.
Oh yeah.
The great poet Robert Frost said, "No surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader." So I think that's very true. Let's get some other questions in the super bench.
For Ms. Simonson, I have an editor question and a writer question.
All right.
They're different. The editor question is, as you said, you worked as editor on Star Wars and Indiana Jones. What was it like working with Lucasfilm on that?
Lucasfilm at the time was relatively mellow. We didn't get a lot of flack, and when they told us we couldn't do something, it was because we knew it was going to be in the next movie. I think it was maybe David's first issue that he wrote. It was after the Death Star had been destroyed, and his thought, the obvious thought was, so we built a new one and put chicken wire over the gap or whatever it was where the torpedo went in, and so he wrote this up and we sent it to Lucasfilm, and Lucasfilm said, "Oh, you can't do that." They wouldn't tell us why, but you can't do that. And we said, well, what if instead of a new Death Star, we just put a big, oddly shaped cannon floating in the sky, up in space over the planet? And they said, "Oh, that's fine." So we did that, and so we knew we couldn't do that. I think we at one point there had been little furry critters with round ears that were, I don't even remember, they were going to be like kite flying, or I don't know, flying on those kind of kites that you hang on to. And they said, "You can't do that." And we said, "Why?" And they said, "We can't tell you." And it turned out it was the Ewoks, was what they were doing. So that was the only time we tripped those switches occasionally, where we were too close to what they were going to do, and then we didn't. But other than that, they were actually very reasonable.
Do you think it's possible that you actually gave them ideas that
No, I don't. I mean, the Death Star idea was pretty. You're building a Death Star, so that was pretty reasonable.
You don't recall anything to the level that Byrne had talked about in his brief time on Indiana Jones, where they kept, like they had approved the script and he'd actually draw the pages, and then they'd want changes made after the pages were drawn?
Maybe that happened. I remember Star Wars for some reason better than I do the Indiana Jones stuff. I do remember, maybe it was a little bit more of a problem, but it wasn't,
Probably a different person.
yeah, it didn't seem that onerous to me, whatever it was. I don't remember them having to read pages, but I wasn't the one who had to redo them, was I?
Right. Superman. What was it like when you got to write Superman? Was there any special, once you sat down realizing, I'm, writing a big one?
You mean, was I totally awe-inspired and whatever? I was excited to be doing Superman, but it was also I was working in a different way on Superman than I had worked over at Marvel. And at Marvel, as we were saying, the editors had a lot of control. The writers had a lot of control at Marvel. They were, when I worked, I didn't get a lot of flack or people trying to tell me what to do on anything. It was very, I had sort of helpful relationships, but not bossy ones. At DC, because Superman was like a skipping rope. I mean, there were 3 Superman books already, and the Man of Steel book was created for me and John Bogdanov to come on and do it. And they had a continuity going where each book was a chapter. So that, sometimes you'd get the beginning of a story, and sometimes you get the middle, and sometimes you get the end of a story. And it took me, probably 6 months to actually figure out how to do that. Eventually, we would have these giant meetings where all of the Superman teams would get together. It was not only the writers and the artists and the editors, but the inkers and the colorists and even the letterers. We would have these giant meetings, and we would all just throw out ideas. And our idea was to create an arc for a year's worth of stories. And we would write them on a big bulletin board. But the assistant editor's job was to make notes, and so that you could work out in advance what you were going to do. But it took me about 6 months to even figure out how to do that. I was so used to control, and it was the hardest thing was to learn to give up some of the control and just the control. You would control your little chapter, but you couldn't control the entire 3-issue arc or 6-issue arc or whatever.
Were you at that meeting when someone piped up, "Let's kill him"?
Oh, yes. It was done so bad. We were mad because they had told us we couldn't do something. We had almost a year's worth of continuity.
The wedding.
Yes. We
That's
had a
so
wedding
hard.
planned, and they said there was going to be a TV show, and Jeanette Kahn came in and said, well, no, there's a TV show and we can't have the characters married because it will confuse the audience. And the comic, they had to be the same, so.
I'm sorry.
So Jerry, we were perturbed because we'd done a year's worth of work, and it was all getting tossed out. And Jerry said, let's kill him. He often said, let's kill him, when we couldn't get budgets. And at that point, we said, yeah, let's kill him. And so we did.
Jerry Ordway.
I'm sorry?
Jerry.
Sorry, Jerry Ordway.
Jerry Ordway,
Jerry
yeah.
Ordway.
Oh, Jerry Ordway, yes, sorry.
Questions in here?
Was Carlin in charge?
Yeah.
Carlin was in charge, and nobody could have done it in Carlin. Carlin, it was running, it was a four-ring service at that point, and Carlin was a brilliant editor for that stuff. Okay, go ahead.
Yep.
I got here a little bit late, so you might have addressed this already, but for both of you, having edited everything in the world ever, and I've read most of it, was there, first of all, a book that you wanted a shot at as an editor that you didn't get, and then what would be your creative team? What would be your dream team for that
Oh,
book?
that's an interesting.
Boy, I'd have to ponder that for longer than we probably have here.
You edited Doctor Strange for a while, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Doctor Strange would have been interesting to do Doctor Strange, or I actually would love to have written the Fantastic Four for like just a whole arc. That would have been fun. But I would maybe like to have done the edited Doctor Strange. That would have been interesting. Just to try to see if I could make it sell.
Who would have been your team?
Who would have been my team? Oh, let's see. Oh, I wanted to make it sell, right? Okay,
Yeah.
I'm going to put Arthur Adams on the art, as if. I'm going to put, let's put Chris. We'll put Chris on the, Chris would have loved it, actually. Put Chris on as a writer. And who will I have ink? Think of somebody for me quick.
With whose pencil?
Arthur Adams.
Go back with what works, Wills.
Okay, Wills. We're putting Wills on as the inker. Okay, there you go.
I have a slightly different take on that. I was editing Doctor Strange for quite a while, and while I was doing that, every once in a while Steve Ditko would come by my office and visit for a bit. And at one point he told me, and I could tell he enjoyed torturing me. He told me that when he quit Marvel originally in the 60s, he had already plotted and penciled 2 more installments of Doctor Strange or Strange Tales that he never turned in. And, you know, I don't know if you guys know it, but when he quit, that big Eternity storyline had just wrapped up. How the hell was he gonna follow that? You know, I wanted to know. So, I was the editor of Doctor Strange at the time, so I said, you know, you gotta bring that in, we'll do a great big special on that. And he goes, no, I don't want people comparing my old stuff with my new stuff. And I go, all right, can you bring them in and just let me look at them? And he goes, no, I'm afraid Xeroxes will get out, and I want people that can compare stuff. So I go, Steve, they're not gonna leave your hands. I'm gonna look over your shoulder while you slow. And he chuckled and he goes, no, they're in my sister's attic in Pennsylvania, and that's where they're staying. And I asked his nephew after he passed away if they'd gone through all that stuff and found them, and he said no, they hadn't. But so as far as Doctor Strange goes, I would have loved to have gotten Ditko to go back to penciling Doctor Strange, but to give it a more modern look for the contemporary audience, I would have probably found an inker who could have modernized it, but would hopefully, you know, not too overpower it.
So not Savage.
No, I was thinking maybe talk to Nolan about not being quite as overpowering.
Well, that would actually have been
But
kind of
with
pretty,
all
wouldn't it?
that double writing and stuff,
Yeah.
oh my goodness. As far as the writing, if I could, I'd have Ditko plot it and then get a more contemporary writer to do the dialogue. So it's both Dr. Strange.
Going back sort of the human resources aspect of editing, I always enjoy reading the staff questions that were in the thing, and you know most of them didn't appear to take them seriously at all. Were those enjoyed by the staff, or did they hate doing them, or was that?
I'm not even sure who really wrote this.
I'm not sure the staff, those were actual, real questions in some cases. I think somebody was just making up things for us to say.
That might have been, to me, that looked, that is the marking of Mark Seary. He was Ralph Macchio's editor at the time, and he also had worked with Mark Seary, so he was a pretty clever guy. Ended up being some huge VP at Comcast. He also, when I was editing he's the guy that often did the fake ads based on the old comic book ads. I thought he did a really good job on those, but I'm pretty sure Mark Seary did most of those bios and that whole thing.
Running low on time, let's take one more question.
During the 1980s, I loved reading the Marvel movie adaptations. Between that and Mad Magazine was how I absorbed movies as a kid. I couldn't get out much. But I'm wondering, is there any easy way to describe why some titles got like an extended universe like Star Wars or Star Trek, while other Marvel movie adaptations just had to stop? Like Last Starfighter or Willow or one of those. Like, what would define when something is fleshed out and when something is just the adaptation and then you drop it?
Probably the popularity of the movie or the popularity of the comic. I mean, Star Wars, you could put Star Wars in anything. It was printing money. It's just, you know, there was the audience was there.
Yeah, I think that's it. Like, Last Starfighter, I think had sort of a cult following, but it wasn't a huge following. So that would have been tough to do. But see, with comics, you have to plan way ahead too. So, you know, the day you start planning, okay, let's go, let's move, you know, it could be half a year before that thing hits the stands. And then back then it was on the newsstand, and it would take 9 months before you got 10 months before you got the final sales figures. So it was really quite a gamble to say, okay, let's commit to doing this before you found out is it selling or not? And meanwhile, you've got all these issues you spend money on to put out there, so they really wanted to know as much as possible that they had a surefire thing on their hands.
I mean, that was a lot of those decisions were corporate, I think, right?
Yeah, and sometimes the studio that was licensing it, might have other plans for it, and they only wanted the film itself, the story to be adapted, because they maybe like Star Wars, they didn't want to have confusing storylines out there that might compete with what they're doing with the film.
Yeah.
Gentleman back nature.
Okay, well, speaking of sales, how much importance or focus did you have to put on sales month to month when you're on your ongoing titles?
Well, it was good if things sold.
I mean, did it keep you from keeping the characters organic to the way you thought that the storyline should progress, or were you thinking, oh, we have to boost sales this month and have to do, X, Y, Z? Or...
You know, the only time I actually did something that was deliberately because I thought I could make something sell was, back in the olden days, it was believed that you could not sell comic books in the fall. The fall was a dead period. Kids were going back to school and they were spending their money on school stuff. And I thought, no, you could sell comic books.
Also,
in
the new
fall.
TV season would start.
Yes, that's true. There were a lot of things that would interest people that were in the fall. And so I said, well, Chris Claremont had an idea in X-Men. He's my pal, then I was freelance. He was going to kill off the Morlocks. I think whoever artist he had, Paul Smith maybe, had drawn too many Morlocks in the tunnels. There were hundreds of them, and Chris said there shouldn't be hundreds. I'm going to kill a batch of them. And I said, hey Chris, can I play? What if we did something in the fall called Mutant Massacre? And maybe, it would just, I didn't honestly, I wanted to sell books in the fall. I loved running experiments on my readers and to see what would work and what wouldn't. Some of them worked and some didn't. But I wanted to see if we could sell something in the fall. And we did Mutant Massacre, and as I guess 3 issues, each of us did 3 issues. Chris was X Factor, New Mutants, and X-Men, of course, and then Power Pack played in it, Thor played in it a little bit. It was one of these things, but it was a crossover. It was the first big crossover, I think, that at least I'd ever participated in. We didn't, none of it was compulsory. It was like, oh, we're going to do this fun thing. We're going to kill a batch of mutants. Do you guys want to play? And, people who wanted to play could play. So we think it was, Spider-Man may have been in it for a minute. I'm not sure. And it turned out that it sold very, very well. So the next fall, Shooter comes to us and he says, okay, we're going to make it sell again. And this is what you're going to do. And Walter and Chris and I, everybody looked at each other in this panicked face because we didn't want him telling us what to do. So we said, oh, no, it's okay, Jim. We already have an idea. We know what we're going to do. It's going to be called Fall of the Mutants. And then we had to sit around and decide what we were going to do.
Can I just ask a quick question?
So poor Doug got dead. Angel got his wings ripped off, and I don't remember what happened to the X-Men. Something or other.
Keep in mind, back then, when I joined staff in '83, at least 2/3 of the sales came from the newsstand market, and only 1/3 maybe from the direct market. So that you wouldn't find out if something really sold on a newsstand until 9 or 10 months after it went on sale because of the way that system worked. And so it's a little hard to make quick adjustments if something wasn't working. And then over the course of a handful of years, that totally inverted. And then eventually, newsstands went away because the markup was so low for the retailers, and the work was so involved. They had to, take the ones that didn't sell off the rack when the new ones came in, and rip off the logo and send them in, and it was just for the amount of money. And somebody figured out that they could put like a leg stocking thing that took up the same square footage and each one of those had a huge markup on it, and all I have to do is plug the same one back in when it gets sold, and you don't have to worry about all this comic book stuff. So comics on the newsstand market eventually went away, and it was totally the direct market, where you got much quicker sales back, but you were selling to an already dedicated fan base that was seeking the comic book stuff, whereas the newsstand racks were where our recruiters was happening. Almost every American in the course of their daily life passed someplace, a variety store, a drugstore, candy store, whatever, a bus depot that had spinner racks, and so a certain percentage of them would buy the comics, a certain percentage of them would get hooked on them and then find the direct market stores. So it was this recruiting thing, and when that went away, you know, all you had left was a few thousand comic book specialty stores left, and most people would never run across them in the course of their daily life. And if they did, a lot of them weren't particularly attractive for a new person to walk in. They didn't look very friendly, and we had sometimes very snobbish people behind the counter, like if a parent came in and bought an Archie for their kid, you know, you get this snide look from the person behind the counter, but it just wasn't a great recruiting thing. And that unfortunately is still an issue we have
I
to
was
this day.
real sorry when the newsstand went away.
We'll take one more question.
I know, it's quick. I'm just curious if, because the genre wasn't as widespread as it is now, if you both had an interest in that genre when you were young, or if there were certain science fiction or fantasy authors when you were young that inspired you, literary people.
When I was young, there weren't really, I guess the superhero comic was Superman, which I read, but not really, you know, I'd get to read it on the newsstand. I had read the Donald Duck comics and Uncle Scrooge, and Spike and Sugar and Spike and Little Lulu. I mean, they were different. It wasn't like the comics are now. I read mostly books. I got, my allowance was 25 cents, and I could spend it on a comic or an ice cream cone, and I could go to the library and get 10 books for free and get an ice cream cone. So I was a book reader. I read, I guess my favorite books when I was a child, I loved the Edward Eager magic books, Half Magic. I don't know if you guys are, A Wrinkle in Time, with Madeline Eagle was another one, although I didn't discover her until later. I don't think they have her at our library. Anything with horses I would read, the Margaret Henry books. Anything with dogs I would read, Jim Kelgar books, is about Larry Setters, but, and Robert Heinlein, when I got to be a little bit older and was allowed in the older kids section, I read Heinlein, juveniles were just, I thought they were wonderful. I loved his characters, that they were smart and they were always resourceful and courageous, but you know, they had their weaknesses too, and I really liked what he did. So I think I wanted to be Robert Heinlein when I grew up, when I was a child.
I read Heinlein, and then in high school, into college, I got into Vonnegut. But as far as, no?
You should read comedies when you were a kid.
Oh, yeah, but usually, you know, I'd mow the lawn, get a quarter, go down to the variety store, buy a 12-cent comic and a 10-cent candy bar, and put the few pennies left in the piggy bank, and you know, I enjoy eating my candy bar where I read my comic. But when I was homesick, for instance, my mom would go to the drugstore and get whatever she asked for, and she'd pick up a handful of comics to keep me occupied from the spirit. But she'd get things like Lucille Ball comics. But they were comics I read under. So back then, as you can tell from what we're saying, the genres and subjects of comics appealed to all ages, genders, everything. There were much, you know, more variety than just superhero stuff.
Lone Ranger comics.
But when I really started getting into them, you know, I first got into the DC war stuff, but then I found Sergeant Fury, and then I saw the house ads for Spider-Man and other stuff, and that was it. I was sunk. And for a long time, it was just Marvel stuff. And then back then, I was telling telling some other people earlier, was social suicide to admit you when you comics episode.
That's right.
And so, when I was in high school, I'd go to the local drugstore and there was a spinner rack right next to the magazine rack. So I pretend I'm looking at the magazines and I'm, with my peripheral vision, I'm rotating the stand with my foot, picking up the comics. And then when I finally sorted that out, I looked around to make sure nobody from my high school was in there. Grab a quick check out as fast as I could. Nowadays, you know, in my adult continuing education classes, I sometimes teach the art teachers who have run the comics clubs for their high schools. And that was inconceivable when I was that age.
Graphic novels in the library.
Yeah,
I mean, there are huge graphic novel sections,
yeah.
which is pretty cool, actually.
I'm a high school media specialist, and I have a section that's comics and graphic novels.
I'm the middle school anime comic book. Not a big library.
We are officially out of time. About 10 minutes over. Folks can linger around. I don't think there's anybody coming into the room. But I do want to thank our panelists. Louise Simonson, Carl